Do you know that they're also attacking the separation of church and state? Allow me to go into that for a few moments. Keith Fournier, who for a considerable period of time was the president of the American Center for Law and Justice, which is Pat Robertson's organization to defend people in religious liberty cases, had this to say: "Yet there is a wall which has been mistakenly erected in our own beloved country. Its impact on religious freedom has perhaps had an even more devastating effect. It is the so-called wall of separation of church and state." Pat Robertson had this to say about the wall of separation, the First Amendment. He says, "They, that is the liberals and secular humanists, have kept us, that is evangelical Protestants, in submission because they have talked about separation of church and state. There is no such thing in the Constitution. It's a lie of the left, and we're not going to take it anymore." He's saying that separation of church and state is a lie of the left, of secular humanists. How different what Thomas Jefferson, who actually is the architect of the Republic of the United States, when he spoke to the Danbury Baptist Association, he said this: "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thus," says Jefferson, he's quoted the First Amendment, then he says, "thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So even if the expression separation of church and state is not in the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson, who is the architect of it, says, he quotes it, and then he says that this is referring to a wall of separation between church and state. Notice what William Rehnquist of the Supreme Court. By the way, did you know that 5 of the Supreme Court justices today are Roman Catholics? Did you know that 4 of them are very, very conservative? One of them is Justice Kennedy, is a little more liberal, but there's 5, which is greater than the proportion of Roman Catholics in the United States. This is significant. Now notice what William Rehnquist, the late Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, had to say. This is, by the way, the chief judge in the whole United States of America. He says, "The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned." That's amazing. Notice what W.A. Criswell had to say. For a long time, he was president of the National Baptist Convention, which would be like in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the General Conference. He was also pastor of the largest Baptist church in the United States for some time, which was the First Baptist Church in Dallas. He said this: "I believe that this notion of the separation of church and state was the figment of some infidel's imagination." By the way, do you know that the Baptists and Anabaptists were persecuted like savage animals in colonial America? And they, more than anyone, stood for religious liberty and the separation of church and state. Total about-face to their position in colonial America and to their position until the moment when John F. Kennedy was elected. Notice what Arizona State Senator John B. Conlon once said. He said, "The separation of church and state is a false issue. It is a slogan created by the secular humanists, which sounds legal, but in fact is a sham. It does not appear anywhere in the Constitution, and it is not a concept that our founding fathers believed." Where was he when Thomas Jefferson spoke, is my question. He continues saying, "Separation of church and state is simply a line of propaganda created by modern humanists to intimidate Christians and make us believe that we are second-class citizens." Notice what Tim LaHaye had to say. "While it is true that God has already given America 3 national revivals in the past, we desperately need another one today." Would you agree that we need another one today? Sure. Now, how do you get that revival? It's by prayer, Bible study, and witnessing, right? Notice the solution he gives. He says, personally, I am not sure we can have one without legislative reform. Since when does legislative reform have anything to do with spiritual revival in the church? By the way, he once spoke about the Christians being the salt of the earth. Notice his definition of Christians being the salt of the earth. He says you can be the salt of the earth by establishing a political action committee, by encouraging and preaching on Christian activism, by organizing a good government committee, by circulating petitions, and by lobbying Congress, by conducting political forums, by introducing candidates at your services. That means the salt of the earth. Be real. The salt of the earth is sharing the spiritual message of Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord.